Richard Whitmore thought the woman standing near the entrance was a mistake. He had no idea she was about to become the most powerful person in the room. Rain tapped softly against the tall mansion windows as black luxury cars lined the circular driveway outside the Whitmore estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Inside, crystal chandeliers glowed over polished marble floors while members of the Whitmore family gathered in expensive black suits and designer dresses, pretending grief while quietly calculating numbers inside their heads. Charles Whitmore, the billionaire founder of Whitmore Holdings, had been dead for exactly 72 hours, and now his family had come for the inheritance. The air smelled of perfume, old money, and hidden resentment. Near the fireplace, Richard Whitmore adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit and checked his reflection in the dark glass of the window. At 52 years old, he carried himself like a man who believed the world already belonged to him. His younger brother Daniel poured himself another glass of whiskey, even though it was barely 11 in the morning. Across the room, Richard's daughter Savannah whispered to her cousin while scrolling through luxury condos on her phone. Everyone was waiting for the reading of the will. Everyone except the woman standing silently by the front door. Vivian Hale stepped into the mansion wearing a simple cream-colored coat damp from the rain outside. Her shoes were modest. Her hair was tied neatly behind her head. No jewelry, no designer purse. Nothing about her matched the room. Conversation slowed almost immediately. A few relatives exchanged looks. Someone near the staircase quietly laughed. Richard noticed her last, and when he did, a smile slowly spread across his face. Not a warm smile. The kind that arrives right before humiliation. "Well," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Looks like the catering staff came early." Several people chuckled. Vivian stopped walking but did not react. Her hands remained folded calmly in front of her. Richard stepped closer, lowering his glass slightly as he examined her from head to toe. "I'm sorry," he continued, "this reading is for family only." More laughter. Even Savannah covered her mouth to hide a grin. Vivian's expression never changed. "Mr. Whitmore requested my presence," she said softly. Richard let out a dry laugh and glanced around the room. "Requested?" he repeated. "That's interesting." He took another slow sip of whiskey. "And what exactly were you to Charles? His assistant? Nurse? Housekeeper?" The room waited. Vivian hesitated for only a second. "A friend." The word seemed to amuse everyone even more. Daniel nearly choked on his drink laughing. "A friend," he said. Charles barely had time for his own family. Richard shook his head with a smirk. "This is unbelievable." He turned toward the others dramatically. The maid came to the inheritance meeting. This time the laughter spread through the entire room. Even the pianist in the corner looked uncomfortable. But Vivian remained still, her eyes steady, her shoulders relaxed. And somehow, that calmness irritated Richard more than anger would have. At the far end of the room, attorney Margaret Ellis finally closed the leather folder she had been reviewing. Unlike the others, she was not smiling. Her sharp gray eyes moved from Richard to Vivian carefully. "Mr. Whitmore," she said firmly, "Miss Hale is expected." The room quieted slightly. Richard turned toward the attorney with visible annoyance. "Expected?" Margaret stood beside the long mahogany table without blinking. "Personally requested by Charles Whitmore before his passing." A hush fell across the room. Richard's smile weakened for half a second before returning. "Well," he said lightly, "that's certainly generous of father." He gestured carelessly toward the back of the room. "There's seating near the door." The message was clear. Not among them. Never among them. Vivian nodded once and walked quietly across the marble floor while whispers followed her like shadows. Some family members watched her with curiosity, others with disgust. One elderly aunt leaned toward another and whispered, "She's probably hoping for a check." Vivian sat alone in the small chair beside the doorway exactly where Richard wanted her. Outside, thunder rolled softly above the estate. Inside, glasses clinked while the Whitmore family prepared themselves for wealth they already believed was theirs. But Margaret Ellis noticed something none of them did. When Vivian sat down, she did not look nervous. She did not look intimidated. She looked almost saddened, as if she already knew something the rest of the room did not. Richard raised his whiskey again confidently, unaware that everything he believed about power, inheritance, and loyalty was about to collapse in front of everyone he knew. Because Charles Whitmore had spent the last 10 years preparing one final decision. And before the afternoon was over, the people laughing at Vivian Hale would wish they never opened their mouths at all. The storm outside grew heavier as servants moved quietly through the Whitmore mansion, carrying silver trays of sparkling water and untouched appetizers. Inside the grand sitting room, the atmosphere had changed from grief to calculation. Family members spoke in lowered voices, but every conversation revolved around money. Who would control Whitmore Holdings? Who would inherit the Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park? Who would receive the $18 million vacation property in Aspen? Nobody spoke about Charles Whitmore himself anymore. Not really. Vivian Hale sat alone beside the doorway exactly where Richard had wanted her, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while the room continued pretending she did not belong there. From her chair, she could hear every whisper. She probably thinks she is getting something. Maybe Charles left her a watch or a bonus check. Honestly, she looks like she came from a grocery store parking lot. Small laughs followed each comment. Vivian lowered her eyes briefly, but never reacted. Across the room, Savannah Whitmore crossed her legs carefully and glanced toward Vivian with open amusement. I still do not understand why Father allowed strangers around Grandpa during the last year, she said loudly enough to be heard. Daniel smirked into his whiskey glass. Lonely old men make strange decisions. Another round of quiet laughter spread across the room. Margaret Ellis remained standing near the fireplace reviewing the final legal documents without participating in any conversation. The older attorney seemed almost detached from the luxury surrounding her. Every few moments, however, her eyes shifted toward Vivian as if silently measuring the room itself. Richard finally approached the center table where several folders containing estate documents had been arranged. He straightened his tie confidently before speaking. "Let us be honest," he announced, spreading his arms slightly. "Father built this company for family. Blood matters." Several relatives nodded immediately. One cousin even raised a champagne glass in agreement. Vivian remained still near the door while rainwater slowly dried on the sleeve of her cream-colored coat. Richard noticed her silence again and smiled coldly. "Although," he added, glancing toward her, "I suppose some people confuse kindness with entitlement." The room grew awkwardly quiet for a second before Daniel laughed under his breath. She should just be grateful she was invited indoors during the rain. Savannah leaned closer to her mother and whispered something that caused both women to laugh again. Vivian heard all of it. Every word. Every insult. But instead of anger, something softer passed through her expression. Sadness. As though she had expected exactly this. A grandfather clock echoed through the mansion with slow, deliberate chimes. 11:30. Margaret finally closed the final folder and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin shortly." Chairs shifted across the marble floor as the family gathered around the long mahogany table. Richard immediately claimed the seat nearest the head of the table without asking anyone. Savannah sat beside him confidently, already imagining herself attached to the Whitmore empire. Daniel loosened his tie and leaned back comfortably as if the inheritance had already been deposited into his account. Vivian quietly remained in the chair near the doorway until Margaret looked directly at her. "Miss Hale," the attorney said calmly, "there is a reserved seat for you at the table." The room froze. Richard's expression hardened instantly. "I do not think that will be necessary," he interrupted. Margaret never looked away from Vivian. "It was specifically requested by Charles Whitmore." A hush fell over the room. Slowly, Vivian stood and walked toward the table while every eye followed her movement across the marble floor. The sound of her modest shoes echoed through the enormous room with uncomfortable clarity. Richard watched in disbelief as Margaret pulled out a chair only 2 seats away from the head of the table itself. Not beside the servants. Not near the exit. Beside the family. And for the first time that morning, uncertainty quietly entered Richard Whitmore's eyes. Richard Whitmore forced a smile as Vivian took the seat Margaret Ellis had prepared for her, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him immediately. The chair placed beside the family was not an accident. In rooms like this, seating meant status. Position meant importance. And Charles Whitmore had understood that better than anyone. Rain streaked slowly down the towering windows, while thunder rolled somewhere over the Connecticut coastline. The long mahogany table reflected the chandelier light above like still water, and for a brief moment nobody spoke. Vivian sat quietly, smoothing the sleeve of her cream-colored coat before folding her hands again. Across from her, Savannah Whitmore stared openly with disbelief. "This is absurd," she muttered under her breath. Daniel leaned closer to Richard. "Did father even know her that well?" he whispered. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Vivian, as though trying to solve a problem that suddenly no longer made sense. Because the truth was simple. None of them had paid attention to Charles during the final years of his life. Not really. The old billionaire had spent most evenings alone inside the enormous estate after his health began declining. His children visited only during holidays or public appearances. Phone calls became shorter. Dinners became rarer. Excuses became easier. But someone else kept showing up. Vivian. Margaret Ellis slowly organized the legal papers in front of her while the silence thickened around the table. "Before we begin the formal reading," she said calmly, "there are personal instructions Mr. Whitmore requested I honor exactly as written." Richard exhaled impatiently. "Can we please move this along?" Margaret ignored him completely. Mr. Whitmore specifically noted that every individual present today should remain until the reading is fully completed. Savannah crossed her arms. "Why would that matter?" Margaret lifted her eyes carefully. "Because according to Mr. Whitmore, character reveals itself most clearly when money enters the room." Another silence followed. Vivian lowered her gaze slightly. The words sounded familiar to her. Charles had said them once before during a winter evening, almost 2 years earlier. She remembered the night clearly. Snow had covered the long driveway outside the estate, while icy wind rattled the old windows upstairs. Charles had been sitting alone in the library wrapped in a gray blanket when Vivian arrived carrying soup from the small diner where she worked part-time. The old man had looked exhausted that evening. Smaller somehow. Human. "You came back," he had said quietly when she entered the room. Vivian placed the soup beside him carefully. "You forgot to eat lunch again." Charles gave a weak smile. "Most people around me remember my money before they remember me." Vivian handed him the spoon gently. "Then they are forgetting the important part." The billionaire studied her face for several seconds as the fire crackled beside them. "Why are you still here?" he finally asked. "You do realize I cannot offer you much anymore besides conversation." Vivian shrugged softly before sitting across from him. "Because nobody should grow old feeling abandoned." Back in the mansion dining room, Richard tapped his fingers impatiently against the table while servants quietly closed the heavy doors behind the family. The soft click echoed through the room like a lock turning. Margaret Ellis noticed Richard watching Vivian again. Not with amusement this time. With uncertainty. Because somewhere deep beneath his confidence, Richard Whitmore had begun sensing something dangerous. His father had trusted this woman, far more than any of them realized. And Charles Whitmore had never done anything without a reason. The tension around the table slowly transformed into greed the moment Margaret Ellis began reading the first section of Charles Whitmore's estate documents. Rain continued tapping against the mansion windows while the family listened with sharpened attention, no longer pretending to mourn. Every item mentioned seemed to awaken something restless inside the room. "The Palm Beach property shall be transferred to Daniel Whitmore." Daniel immediately leaned back with a satisfied grin before whispering to Savannah, "That place alone is worth at least $12 million. Savannah smiled tightly. "The Aspen residence and attached land holdings shall be divided equally between Savannah Whitmore and Claire Whitmore." Savannah straightened instantly, unable to hide her excitement. "I knew Grandpa would never forget family," she said softly while adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Vivian remained silent beside them, her hands resting calmly near the edge of the table. Richard occasionally glanced toward her, still trying to understand why she had been placed there at all. Every few minutes another asset was announced. Luxury vehicles, art collections, investment accounts, vacation properties. Each name called seemed to make the Whitmore family more confident, more relaxed, more careless. They had already started mentally spending the fortune before the reading was even complete. Daniel quietly opened his phone beneath the table, searching for yachts available along the Connecticut shoreline. Savannah whispered about remodeling the Aspen property before winter season. One cousin joked about finally quitting his law firm job. Nobody noticed Vivian except when they wanted to remind her she did not belong. "Must be fascinating hearing how wealthy families operate," Claire Whitmore said with a polished smile toward Vivian. "I imagine this is all very new for you." A few relatives laughed quietly. Vivian simply nodded once. I am happy Mr. Whitmore's wishes are being respected. Claire exchanged an amused look with Savannah, as if the response itself sounded unsophisticated. Richard folded his hands carefully. Father always appreciated loyalty, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Although sometimes he confused loyalty with dependency. His eyes shifted toward Vivian for only a second. The message landed exactly as intended. But Margaret Ellis suddenly stopped reading. The pause stretched long enough for several family members to look up impatiently. The attorney adjusted her glasses before opening another folder that appeared older than the others. There are additional instructions attached to the remainder of the estate, she said calmly. Richard frowned slightly. What remainder? Margaret ignored the interruption. Mr. Whitmore requested that the final section be read without interruption. Daniel laughed under his breath. What is left at this point? A few charities? But Margaret's expression never changed. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the tall windows behind her, washing the room in pale silver light before fading again. Vivian lowered her eyes toward the table as though she already knew what was coming. Richard noticed the movement immediately. You seem unusually calm, he said carefully. Vivian looked back at him with the same quiet expression that had unsettled him since she arrived. Your father valued honesty, she answered softly. That is all. Richard forced a smile again, but irritation flickered behind it now. Because something about the room no longer felt predictable. The Whitmores had expected celebration today. Instead, uncertainty had begun creeping slowly across the marble floors like cold water. Margaret placed one hand over the unopened folder in front of her. Unlike the polished legal documents stacked beside it, this envelope looked personal, almost sacred. A single line had been written across the front in Charles Whitmore's uneven handwriting. Margaret stared at it briefly before speaking. These were Mr. Whitmore's final private instructions. The room grew still. Even the sound of rain outside seemed quieter now. Richard straightened in his chair confidently, believing the final pages would confirm what he had expected all along. Control of the empire. Complete authority. The Whitmore name secured exactly where it belonged. But Charles Whitmore had spent years watching the true character of everyone sitting at that table. And the final pages in Margaret Ellis's hands were never meant to reward the loudest people in the room. Margaret Ellis rested her hand on the sealed envelope for several long seconds while the Whitmore family waited with growing impatience around the table. The room had become unnaturally still. Even Daniel lowered his whiskey glass without taking another sip. Outside, rain slid slowly down the mansion windows while distant thunder rolled across the dark afternoon sky. Richard Whitmore leaned forward confidently, convinced the final documents would officially place Whitmore Holdings under his control. After all, he was the eldest son, the public face of the company. The obvious choice. At least that was what everyone in the room believed. Margaret carefully broke the seal on the envelope. The sound of tearing paper echoed softly through the silence. Vivian sat motionless beside her, her calm expression almost unsettling now. Richard noticed it again and narrowed his eyes slightly. What exactly is in there? Savannah finally asked. Margaret unfolded a single handwritten letter and adjusted her glasses. This section contains Mr. Whitmore's personal statement regarding the remainder of his estate. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. Hopefully Father did not leave the dog another trust fund. A few nervous smiles appeared around the table, but Margaret did not react. She began reading in a steady voice. To my family, if you are hearing these words, then my time has ended and your true character has likely already revealed itself. The room shifted uncomfortably. Richard crossed his arms slowly. Margaret continued. For many years, I believed success meant building an empire. I now understand that success means discovering who remains beside you after the empire no longer matters. Savannah's confident expression weakened slightly. Margaret's voice remained calm and precise. There were nights inside this house when I sat completely alone. Holidays where phone calls lasted less than 60 seconds. Weeks where business associates showed me more kindness than my own blood. Nobody interrupted her now. The only sound came from rain against glass and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Vivian lowered her eyes quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. Margaret turned the page carefully. However, one person continued showing up without expectation, without greed, and without performance. One person treated me like a human being instead of a financial institution. Daniel shifted in his chair. Savannah stopped looking at her phone entirely. Richard stared directly at Margaret now, his confidence slowly hardening into concern. Then Margaret read the next sentence. Vivian Hale reminded me what loyalty looks like when nobody is watching. Silence. Complete silence. Richard blinked once as though he had misheard the name. Across the table, Claire Whitmore slowly frowned. Daniel let out a short laugh of disbelief. Wait, he said. This is about her. Margaret did not answer him. She simply continued reading Charles Whitmore's words exactly as written. The people most obsessed with inheriting my fortune rarely visited me while I was alive. The woman they ignored sat beside me during storms, during illness, and during the loneliest nights of my life. Vivian's hands tightened slightly together beneath the table for the first time all afternoon. Richard leaned back slowly, but the color had begun fading from his face. The room no longer felt under his control. It felt like a courtroom moments before a verdict. Margaret finally lowered the handwritten letter and opened the final legal document beneath it. Her expression remained unreadable. There is one final beneficiary named in the estate. Savannah whispered immediately, Dad, this has to be symbolic. Richard forced a thin smile that no longer looked convincing. Of course it is. But Margaret Ellis looked directly toward Vivian before speaking again. And in that moment, something cold moved quietly through the Whitmore family. Because deep down, they suddenly realized Charles Whitmore had not gathered them in that mansion to reward them. He had gathered them there to expose them. Margaret Ellis slowly reached beneath the stack of legal documents and removed a small black remote from beside her folder. The movement immediately caught everyone's attention around the table. Richard Whitmore frowned. What now? He asked sharply. Margaret looked toward the large television mounted above the fireplace. Mr. Whitmore left a final recording to be played before the remainder of the estate is disclosed. Daniel sighed impatiently and leaned back in his chair. Of course he did. But nobody laughed this time. The atmosphere inside the mansion had changed completely. The confidence that filled the room earlier that afternoon was beginning to crack. Margaret pressed the remote. The screen flickered once before the image slowly appeared. Charles Whitmore sat alone in his private library wearing a dark sweater instead of one of his usual tailored suits. He looked older than anyone remembered. Smaller somehow. Human. The fire behind him cast warm light across the room, while rain tapped softly against the library windows. For several seconds, Charles simply stared into the camera without speaking. The silence itself unsettled the room. Then the old billionaire finally spoke. If this recording is being played, he said quietly, then I am no longer here to protect the truth myself. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Savannah lowered her eyes. Charles continued. My family spent years believing my greatest fear was losing money. They were wrong. His voice weakened slightly before continuing. My greatest fear was dying surrounded by people who only loved what I could give them. A hush fell across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. On the screen, Charles slowly looked down at his hands. There were birthdays where I ate alone in this house. Surgeries where my attorney stayed longer than my own children. Entire weeks where the only genuine conversation I had came from someone who expected nothing from me. Richard's expression hardened. Father was emotional near the end, he muttered quietly. But Margaret heard him. Please do not interrupt the recording. The old billionaire looked back into the camera again. Wealth creates a dangerous illusion, he said softly. It makes people perform love instead of living it. Daniel stared down at the table now, unable to meet the screen. Savannah folded her arms tightly as discomfort spread through the room like cold air. Then Charles smiled faintly for the first time in the video. But every once in a while, life sends someone honest into your world. Vivian's breathing slowed almost imperceptibly beside the table. Charles continued speaking. Vivian Hale never asked me for stock options. She never asked for vacations, property, jewelry, or influence. She brought me soup during snowstorms. She stayed when my hands shook too badly to hold a coffee cup. She sat beside me on nights when this mansion felt emptier than any hotel room in America. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, Claire Whitmore looked visibly shaken now. Charles leaned slightly closer to the camera. To the people sitting at that table today, I want you to understand something clearly. The woman you underestimated understood me better than anyone carrying my last name. Silence swallowed the room completely. Even the rain outside seemed distant now. Vivian kept her eyes lowered while Charles continued. Character reveals itself in private moments. Not public speeches. Not charity galas. Not board meetings. The billionaire paused for several long seconds before speaking again. If you mocked Vivian Hale before this recording began, then you already proved my point. Richard froze completely at those words. Savannah slowly looked toward her father. Daniel swallowed hard. The room no longer belonged to the Whitmores. It belonged to Charles. Even after death. Then the old billionaire took one slow breath and delivered the sentence that changed everything. The final decision regarding my estate was not based on blood. It was based on loyalty. The television screen slowly faded to black after Charles Whitmore's final words, leaving only the reflection of the stunned family staring back at themselves from the dark glass above the fireplace. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. The silence inside the mansion felt heavier now, almost unbearable, as though the room itself had turned against them. Rain continued falling outside, while the grandfather clock echoed through the hallway one slow second. At a time, Richard Whitmore remained frozen in his chair, his fingers locked tightly around the edge of the table. Across from him, Savannah stared downward with pale disbelief, while Daniel rubbed his forehead repeatedly, as if trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Vivian Hale sat quietly beside Margaret Ellis with the same calm expression she had carried since entering the mansion hours earlier. But now the room looked at her differently. Not like an outsider. Like a threat. Margaret carefully turned off the television and placed the remote beside the folders. Then she opened the final legal document in front of her. "I will now read the remainder of Charles Whitmore's estate instructions," she announced. Richard immediately straightened. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he said quickly. Father was emotional near the end. He was isolated. Vulnerable. Margaret lifted her eyes slowly. Mr. Whitmore amended these documents 6 separate times over the last 4 years. The color drained slightly from Richard's face. Every amendment was reviewed personally by multiple attorneys, medical evaluators, and financial trustees. The documents are fully enforceable. Daniel laughed nervously. "Fine. Then just read it." Margaret nodded once and began. To Vivian Hale, in recognition of her loyalty, compassion, and unwavering presence during the final years of my life, I leave controlling ownership of Whitmore Holdings. The room went silent. Completely silent. Savannah's mouth slowly opened in disbelief. Daniel stared blankly across the table. Claire Whitmore actually dropped the pen from her hand onto the marble floor. But Margaret continued reading without pause. Included within this transfer are all executive voting shares, primary trust accounts, investment holdings, the Greenwich estate, and all remaining personal assets under the Charles Whitmore Legacy Trust. Richard suddenly stood so fast his chair slammed backward against the hardwood floor. "No," the single word echoed through the mansion. Margaret did not react. "The total estimated valuation of the transferred estate currently exceeds $480 million. Daniel nearly whispered, "Dear God." Richard stared directly at Vivian now, as if seeing her for the first time. Not the quiet woman in the cream-colored coat. Not the woman he mocked near the doorway. Something else entirely. "This is insane," he snapped. She manipulated him. Vivian finally looked up calmly. "I did not ask him for anything." Richard ignored her completely and turned toward Margaret. "Contest it," he demanded. "There has to be a way to contest this." Margaret folded her hands together. The estate structure was specifically designed to prevent legal reversal. Savannah shook her head slowly. "Grandpa would never do this to family." Margaret's expression hardened for the first time all afternoon. According to Mr. Whitmore, family was precisely the issue. Another silence crashed through the room. Richard's breathing became uneven now. The powerful executive who entered the mansion expecting absolute control suddenly looked lost inside his own home. Daniel sank back into his chair with empty eyes while several relatives began whispering anxiously among themselves. But Vivian remained still. No smile. No celebration. No revenge in her expression at all. Only sadness. Because unlike everyone else in the room, she understood exactly how lonely Charles Whitmore had truly been. Richard slowly looked around the table at the faces of his own family, realizing something unbearable. Every cruel joke, every insult, Every dismissive glance thrown at Vivian that afternoon had happened directly in front of the one person who now owned everything they had spent their entire lives expecting to inherit. And somewhere inside that silence, the Whitmore family finally understood the terrible mistake they had made the moment Vivian Hale walked through the front door. The room erupted into scattered voices the moment the shock finally broke. Chairs scraped across the hardwood floor. Relatives began talking over one another in disbelief, while rain hammered harder against the windows of the Whitmore mansion. The elegant calm that had defined the afternoon disappeared completely. Panic had entered the room now. Real panic. Richard Whitmore stood near the head of the table with both hands pressed against the polished wood as though trying to steady himself. His carefully controlled image was collapsing in front of everyone. "This cannot stand," he snapped again, his voice sharper now. "My father built this company with our family name." Margaret Ellis calmly organized the legal papers before responding. "And he transferred that company exactly as he intended." Daniel rose from his chair next. "There must have been pressure on him," he argued quickly. "He was elderly, sick, vulnerable." Margaret looked at him without emotion. Mr. Whitmore passed every mental competency evaluation required by law. Daniel fell silent immediately. Across the table, Savannah slowly turned toward Vivian for the first time without arrogance in her eyes. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. Vivian looked at her with honest surprise. "No." The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Because it was true. Vivian had never once asked Charles Whitmore for money, property, or influence. And suddenly everyone in the room understood that truth at the exact same time. Richard began pacing slowly beside the fireplace, running one trembling hand across his mouth while trying to regain control of the situation. "You do not understand what this means," he said toward Vivian. "Whitmore Holdings employs thousands of people. This is not some personal gift." Vivian remained seated calmly. "Your father understood that better than anyone." Richard stopped walking. "You think you can run a company like this?" he demanded bitterly. Vivian met his stare without raising her voice. "I think your father made his decision carefully." The room went silent again. That calmness in her voice unsettled Richard more than anger ever could. He wanted defensiveness, emotion, fear, but Vivian gave him none of it. Claire Whitmore suddenly leaned forward. "Perhaps we all said things earlier that we did not mean," she offered carefully. Savannah immediately nodded in agreement. "Yes, we were emotional today." Daniel forced a strained smile toward Vivian. "Nobody intended to make you uncomfortable." The shift in tone was almost surreal. Only hours earlier they had mocked her clothes, her presence, and her place in the mansion. Now every word became softer, more cautious, because power had changed hands without warning. Vivian watched them quietly, saying nothing at first. Margaret Ellis observed the entire room with silent understanding. She had seen wealthy families unravel before, but never this quickly. Richard finally stopped pacing and faced Vivian directly. His voice lowered now, almost controlled again. "Vivian," he said carefully, "perhaps we got off on the wrong foot today." The sentence sounded unnatural coming from him. Forced. Heavy. Vivian studied him for several long seconds while rainwater traced down the glass behind him like fading tears. Then she asked one simple question. "Were any of you kind to Charles before you knew about the inheritance?" Nobody answered. Savannah looked away immediately. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the table. Claire tightened her lips without speaking. Richard himself stood completely still. The silence that followed was devastating because everyone in the room knew the answer. Vivian slowly rose from her chair beside the table. Her cream-colored coat still looked modest against the wealth surrounding her, but somehow she now carried more authority than anyone inside the mansion. Not because of the money, because she had been the only person in the room who never came there seeking it. Richard watched her carefully as realization settled across his face piece by piece. Charles Whitmore had not simply changed his will. He had delivered a final judgment on everyone sitting at that table. And the people who once laughed at Vivian Hale were now standing inside a house that no longer belonged to them. For several long moments after Vivian Hale stood from the table, nobody inside the Whitmore mansion knew what to say. The storm outside had begun to weaken, but inside the room the silence remained heavy and humiliating. Crystal glasses sat untouched beside stacks of inheritance documents, while members of the Whitmore family avoided looking directly at one another. Earlier that afternoon, they had entered the mansion expecting celebration. Now they sat surrounded by the wreckage of their own arrogance. Vivian reached for her cream-colored coat quietly and slipped it over her shoulders. The movement was simple, almost ordinary, yet every eye in the room followed her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer needed to. Richard Whitmore watched her near the doorway with exhausted disbelief. The powerful executive who had mocked her arrival now looked smaller somehow, stripped of the certainty that money and status had protected him his entire life. "Vivian," he finally said, his voice lower than before. "Perhaps we should discuss the future of the company together." The sentence sounded painfully difficult for him to say. Vivian paused beside the doorway and turned toward him calmly. Rainwater shimmered across the tall windows behind her, while evening shadows slowly settled through the mansion. "Your father already discussed it with me," she answered softly. Richard swallowed hard. "You cannot walk into a world like this overnight." Vivian studied him quietly before replying. "Charles Whitmore spent years preparing me for responsibility. He simply did not prepare you for disappointment." The room fell silent again. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the table, while Savannah stared at the floor beside her chair. Nobody defended Richard now. Nobody laughed anymore. Margaret Ellis closed the final folder carefully and stood beside the fireplace, watching Vivian with something close to respect. She had spent decades working among wealthy families and powerful executives, yet very few people carried dignity the way Vivian did in that moment. No revenge, no cruelty, no celebration, only grace. Vivian glanced once around the enormous mansion. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the expensive paintings hanging on the walls. Charles Whitmore had built an empire large enough to impress strangers and intimidate competitors. But in the end, none of those things had mattered as much as kindness shown in private moments. Vivian understood that better than anyone there. As she reached for the front door, Savannah suddenly spoke in a small, uncertain voice. "Why did you stay?" Vivian looked back gently. Savannah's eyes appeared younger now somehow, stripped of entitlement for the first time. When everyone else stopped visiting him, Savannah asked quietly, "Why did you keep coming back?" Vivian rested one hand against the brass door handle before answering. "Because loneliness should never be the price of growing old." A hush fell across the mansion. Even Richard lowered his eyes after hearing the words. Vivian opened the door slowly. Cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the scent of rain and wet stone from the long driveway outside. Black clouds were beginning to break above the estate, revealing faint silver light behind them. Margaret stepped forward one final time. "Miss Hale," she said respectfully, "your driver is waiting." Vivian nodded politely. Then, without another word, she walked out of the mansion that now belonged entirely to her. The sound of her modest shoes faded softly across the stone entrance while the Whitmore family remained frozen around the table Charles Whitmore had once sat beside alone. Nobody tried stopping her. Nobody knew how. Because deep down, every person in that room understood the truth too late. The woman they mocked had never needed their approval. She had already earned something far more valuable: trust. And as Vivian Hale disappeared into the quiet evening rain, the Whitmore mansion stood silent behind her, filled with people who finally understood that money can purchase luxury, power, and influence, but dignity is earned only through compassion when nobody else is watching.